As you know, the topic today, tax increment financing or TIF districts, and maybe a month or so ago, I know Alan Bell, the economic director, development director, sometimes called the urban development director at the city of Wichita, was here to talk to you about this topic. And Mr. Bell, I think, did a very thorough job of explaining kind of the mechanisms and the legal background of TIF districts and where some TIF districts are in the city and how they're performing and things like that. So I don't want to go through a lot of those things because I think Mr. Bell did a pretty good job of doing that. But just to summarize very quickly, tax increment financing is available, I think, in almost every state of our country. And the laws are typically implemented at the state level, so they do vary a little bit in both what the mechanism is called and how it precisely works as you go from state to state. But basically, a city usually identifies an area that they'd like to have more development in. Oftentimes, it's because the development is, or the area currently is run down and blighted, but that's not always the case. And what they do is they look at how much property tax is being paid by this property in the first year of this plan for TIF districts, and they call that the base. And then as development happens in this district, and it happens because government induces it, so it usually does happen, at least some of it, as development happens, the property rises in value. That's because the assessor drives by and says that property's gone up in value. So these properties start paying more tax. That additional tax beyond what the tax was in the very first year is called the increment. That's where the increment and tax increment financing comes from. And that increment is used to benefit that development district itself. So for example, I've developed a little table there at the top of my handout that shows the difference between what can happen within a TIF development, in other words, the TIF developers column, and what happens to non-TIF developers. And to me, this is important because what Mr. Bell said last week, or last month, I'm sorry, he was precisely accurate in almost everything that he said. I mean, the mechanism behind a TIF district is they work a certain way, and the law says this and that, and so forth like that. But whether it's good public policy, of course, is a different matter, and that's where I would very much disagree with Mr. Bell's characterization of TIF being a good thing. Now, what do developers have to do? Well, oftentimes what they need to do is they need to acquire land, they may need to demolish existing structures, and that's particularly prevalent in TIF districts because oftentimes, well, usually a TIF district is a blighted area, so oftentimes there are structures already there that need to be torn down. And then site preparation, I don't know exactly what that means, but if you're a TIF developer, how are you going to pay for those types of things? Well, what the city will typically do is issue bonds and use the proceeds of those bonds to pay to have these types of activities done. Now, if you're a non-TIF developer, if you're developing anywhere in town that's not within the confines of a TIF district, who pays for those types of things? Well, the answer is, of course, the developers themselves have to pay, either through their own capital or borrowing or whatever, but they have to pay. Well, another thing that typically needs to happen with developments is you're going to need streets, you're going to need sewers, street lights, traffic signals, maybe water mains, and all sorts of things like that that we call infrastructure. And the answer is, well, who pays for those types of things? Well, if you're working within the confines of TIF district, again, this is something that's eligible for TIF financing. So the city's going to issue some bonds, they're going to borrow some money, and then they're going to pay for those types of things to be done to your development. Now, you might be thinking, and this needs to be kind of an attitude amongst the City Council and County Commission, that these things like infrastructure, such as streets and sewers and so forth, well, that's something that's the job of the city to do. Isn't that what governments do, provide infrastructure? Well, the answer is no. Typically, in non-TIF developments, the developers have to pay themselves for those types of things. And I think I've gotten into some arguments with a few people, in fact, a City Council member, even the mayor himself, about these types of things. They just think that, you know, a real estate development, let's say, well, at 13th and Webb Road, because that's when I did some research on the waterfront out there, that it develops and magically streets and stoplights and all sorts of things turn up like that. But that's not true. I did some research into the special tax assessments that were done for the waterfront project at 13th and Webb Road. I researched the city ordinances to find out what they passed and what special taxes they levied and so forth. And I came up with about $3.3 million worth of infrastructure, like a water distribution system. That street that runs through the waterfront from 13th up, winding up through Webb Road, that cost them almost $1.7 million. Now that's the type of thing that we might call infrastructure, but who paid for that? Well, the answer is the developers of the waterfront project. They were assessed special taxes totaling altogether at least $3.3 million to pay for these types of things. Now, if they were developing within a TIF district, what would happen is the city would issue bonds to pay for those types of things, so there'd be no out-of-pocket cost to the developers or no special taxes that they'd have to pay in order to retire those bonds. Instead, what would happen is, because those things have built, and probably because the developers have built some buildings, the value of that property's gone up. Their property tax bill is going to go up, just like anybody's does when they build buildings and improve their land. Their property tax bill is going to go up. But what happens to that increased property tax is it goes to pay off those bonds that were used to build the streets and sewers and streetlights and all sorts of things like that. In a non-TIF development, those extra taxes go to the general government, to fund the general operations of government, to pay for, well, you know, all the types of things that a government does for us. So that's really the distinction between developers working within a TIF district and those working outside a TIF district. Yes, the TIF developers don't escape paying their property taxes, but instead their property taxes are used to pay back money that was borrowed to develop specifically them. So I say that TIF districts effectively allow developers to escape paying increased property taxes, because every dime they pay, or at least a lot of it, goes back to development themselves in particular. So that's kind of the mechanical aspects of the way that TIF districts works. Now, it is kind of a confusing thing, and I probably confused you even further, but that really is kind of one of the benefits of TIF districts. I testified at the city council meeting, I think it was the December 2nd meeting, in opposition to this downtown arena TIF district, and I mentioned that TIF districts, the mechanism behind it is quite confusing, and I said, well, this is accomplished through a confusing arrangement that hides the reality and size of the subsidy given to TIF developers. I've come to realize that this confusion serves a useful purpose to this council, because if the people of Wichita knew what was really happening, they'd be outraged. And I think that's really true, that once people realize that the TIF developers live in this special world where their own property taxes benefit themselves exclusively, it really gives rise to a little bit of resentment. And you have to start wondering, well, what's the motive for anybody to develop anything outside of the TIF district, since the TIF developers are given such a big head start? And, you know, that's a very good question. Will pretty soon the whole city become a TIF district? You know, that was one of the objections that the Sedgwick County Commissioners gave back in August when they decided not to go along with the original downtown arena TIF district. The letter that County Manager Bill Buchanan sent over to the city said every piece of land in downtown Wichita is now part of some sort of tax advantage type of district, where they're either not paying property taxes all that they should be, or their property taxes are being plowed back in to benefit the cost of the development. And so it's really, from a matter of public policy, you have to wonder, well, what about these guys developing elsewhere? Now, at that city council meeting, and also at Wednesday's county commission meeting, Jeff Fleur, the head of the Downtown Development Corporation, and Joe Johnson, the chair of it, the outgoing chair, he didn't really say this, Jeff said it, but he talked about how this TIF district is going to be something that's going to drive the whole city to become, I don't remember exactly what it said, you know, but it's going to be a good thing for the whole city as a whole. And I've done some research on this. And as a matter of fact, John and I had breakfast with those two gentlemen this morning, and Joe Johnson said, well, I'd like to see the research that you found that says that TIF districts are not good for the community as a whole. Well, I didn't have my briefcase with me, or I might have handed this to him, but this is a study from the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois, which talks about, I've given you some quotes from it in the handout there, so I'm not going to read them to you, but basically, does TIF financing help the development within a TIF district? Absolutely it does, very much so. As a matter of fact, some of the TIF districts don't generate enough tax revenue to pay off the bonds, but I don't think we've had any TIF districts where at least something has not happened, some sort of development or something good